Science fiction has never been only about the future. At its most serious, it has always been about prediction, how societies imagine tomorrow, based on the pressures, fears, and assumptions of their own time. Some of those predictions are remembered. Others are quietly discarded. This episode focuses on the latter. Between the early 1970s and the mid-1990s, Hollywood released a number of science fiction action films that presented futures audiences were not ready to accept. These films did not promise technological salvation or heroic resolution. Instead, they portrayed systems that failed slowly, societies that adapted to loss and progress that arrived without improvement. Many of them struggled commercially or were dismissed as too bleak, too restrained, or too uncomfortable. Studios moved on. The futures they depicted were left behind. This video examines 15 of those films. They were not rejected because they lacked imagination. They were rejected because they challenged prevailing narratives about advancement control and human behavior. Rather than exaggerating catastrophe, they focused on consequences. Rather than celebrating innovation, they questioned who benefits from it and who is left behind. Their visions were coherent, but they conflicted with what audiences wanted science fiction to provide at the time. The films selected here follow one consistent thread. Each presents a version of tomorrow that was treated seriously by its creators, but abandoned by the industry. These are not fantasy worlds or distant allegories. They are grounded projections shaped by real anxieties, environmental decline, technological overreach, institutional failure, and social fragmentation. Animation superhero films and pure escapist science fiction are excluded to keep the focus on futures intended as warnings rather than entertainment. Viewed today, many of these films feel less extreme than they once did. Their technologies may look dated, but their underlying assumptions remain intact. They did not predict specific devices or events. They identified patterns, how systems behave under pressure, and how societies justify decisions once consequences become unavoidable. As this countdown begins, the goal is not to rank influence or popularity. It is to revisit futures that were set aside and ask why they were dismissed, and whether the discomfort they caused then might explain why they feel increasingly familiar now. No Escape, 1994. No Escape imagines a future defined by institutional retreat rather than technological excess. Faced with social failure, the system does not reform itself. It isolates the problem. Punishment becomes relocation, and responsibility is removed from public view. The future operates through abandonment rather than correction. The film is set around a penal colony designed to function without oversight. Authority withdraws, leaving inhabitants to organize survival on their own terms. Order emerges through dominance and adaptation, not justice. Civilization persists, but only by narrowing its definition of who belongs within it. The film's central argument is that progress can take the form of exclusion. When systems prioritize efficiency over rehabilitation, removal becomes a solution. Problems are contained rather than addressed. The future appears stable because instability has been displaced. Audiences found this premise unsettling because it required little imagination. The world of No Escape does not rely on advanced technology or speculative science. It extends existing policies to their logical conclusion. The lack of spectacle made the scenario feel uncomfortably plausible. Revisited, now the film feels direct. Societies often manage disorder by moving it out of sight rather than resolving its causes. No Escape was set aside because it refused to frame this outcome as extreme. It treated it as an administrative decision, suggesting that the most dangerous futures may arrive quietly justified as practical solutions rather than moral failures. Nemesis, 1992. Nemesis depicts a future where the boundary between human and machine has largely disappeared. Physical augmentation, is common identity, is unstable, and survival depends on constant modification. Technology does not arrive as a solution. It arrives as a requirement reshaping bodies and behavior at a pace that leaves little room for reflection. The film follows an enforcer navigating a world where enhancement defines status and power. Mechanical upgrades replace vulnerability, but they also erase continuity. As the body becomes modular, the sense of self becomes negotiable. Loyalty, memory, and morality are all subject to revision. Progress is measured in capability, not coherence. The core idea is that technological integration does not stop at assistance. It moves toward replacement. When improvement becomes continuous, there is no stable point at which humanity can be defined. Identity fragments under the pressure to adapt, and distinction loses meaning. The future becomes functional, but hollow. Audiences in the early 1990s struggled with this tone. Cyberpunk was often expected to deliver style rebellion or philosophical distance. Nemesis offered brutality instead. Its world was transactional and emotionally vacant, presenting augmentation as necessity rather than choice. Viewed today, the film's concerns feel grounded. As technology increasingly merges with the body and decision-making becomes automated, the question of where humanity ends becomes practical rather than abstract. Nemesis was overlooked because it suggested that evolution could occur without intention, eroding identity, without ever announcing the moment it begins. 3. Dark Angel, 1990. Dark Angel presents a future where technological advancement coexists with social breakdown. Urban environments are degraded. Institutions are strained, and innovation amplifies existing problems rather than resolving them. The future is not distant. It is embedded within present conditions. The film follows law enforcement operating in a city shaped by inequality and corruption. Advanced technology exists, but it serves exploitation rather than stability. Bodies become resources, and addiction becomes infrastructure. Order survives through force, not reform. The core idea is that progress does not distribute benefits evenly. When systems evolve faster than social structures, disparity intensifies. Technology accelerates harm by making it more efficient and harder to regulate. Audiences at the time dismissed the film as excessive and abrasive. Its vision lacked the clean aesthetics associated with science fiction. Instead, it presented decay as an unavoidable companion to advancement. Revisited now, Dark Angel feels direct. Innovation often amplifies existing power dynamics rather than correcting them. The film was set aside because it refused to present the future as aspirational. It treated it as an extension of unresolved social failure. 4. Moontrap, 1989. Moontrap approaches the future as a problem of inheritance. Instead of focusing on humanity's expansion, it examines what remains when advanced civilizations disappear. The film treats exploration not as conquest, but as confrontation with unresolved consequences. The narrative centers on the discovery of ancient technology that continues operating long after its creators are gone. These systems persist without context, following directives that no longer align with survival or intent. Progress once initiated proves difficult to contain or deactivate. The film's argument is that longevity is not inherently virtuous. Systems designed to endure can become threats when they outlast the understanding that shaped them. Advancement without limits creates artifacts that resist correction. Audiences expected space-based science fiction to emphasize movement, discovery, and achievement. Moontrap offered hesitation instead. Its future was defensive, cautious, and suspicious of unchecked progress. This tone lacked immediacy and was quickly forgotten. Viewed today, the film feels relevant. Technologies increasingly persist beyond their original purpose, influencing environments they were never meant to inhabit. Moontrap was overlooked because it framed endurance itself as a risk rather than an accomplishment. 5. Cherry 2000, 1987. Cherry 2000 presents a future where emotional risk has been systematically minimized. Relationships are regulated. Compatibility is calculated and intimacy is mediated through contracts and technology. What remains is not isolation, but a carefully managed version of connection designed to avoid uncertainty. The story is set in a society shaped by instability, where personal attachment is treated as a liability. Artificial partners exist to replace the unpredictability of human relationships. Desire is customizable, conflict is avoidable, and commitment becomes a technical agreement rather than an emotional process. The film's central idea is that systems built to protect people from pain can also remove depth. When connection is optimized for safety, it loses authenticity. Technology does not suppress emotion directly. It reorganizes it into manageable formats that discourage vulnerability. At the time, audiences viewed this future as eccentric rather than cautionary. The film avoided overt dystopian imagery and framed its world as a practical adaptation rather than a collapse. This restraint made its implications easy to overlook. Seen now, Cherry 2000 reads as a critique of emotional automation. As systems increasingly shape how relationships form and function, the film's concerns feel grounded. It was set aside because it suggested that convenience could quietly replace intimacy without resistance. 6. The Philadelphia Experiment, 1984. The Philadelphia Experiment approaches the future as a byproduct of ambition rather than discovery. Its premise centers on a military test intended to gain advantage with little consideration for human consequence. When the experiment succeeds, it produces displacement rather than progress. The story follows individuals removed from their original time and forced into a future that offers no guidance or reintegration. Technology works as designed, but its effects are irreversible. Identity fractures. Orientation is lost. Survival becomes a matter of adjustment rather than achievement. The film's argument is that innovation pursued without ethical planning creates outcomes that cannot be undone. Advancement is measured by capability, not responsibility. Once boundaries are crossed, the cost is absorbed by those least equipped to bear it. Audiences expected time travel to provide spectacle or paradox-driven intrigue. Instead, the film emphasized confusion and psychological strain. Its future was not exciting. It was dislocating. Hollywood showed little interest in a science fiction narrative that treated success as damage. Revisited today, the film's warning feels grounded. Progress often moves faster than safeguards. Consequences appear later detached from the decisions that caused them. The Philadelphia Experiment was set aside because it framed the future as something that could arrive before anyone is ready to live in it. 7. Cloak and Dagger in 84. Cloak and Dagger explores a future where advanced systems reach individuals long before they are prepared to understand them. The film places espionage, digital secrets, and global conflict within the everyday life of a child, collapsing the boundary between innocence and complexity. The narrative follows a young protagonist drawn into a conflict driven by information rather than force. Technology is not presented as a tool to be mastered, but as an intrusion that reshapes perception. Reality becomes difficult to separate from simulation, and imagination turns into a coping mechanism rather than escape. The film's central concern is exposure. When access arrives without comprehension, vulnerability increases. Systems designed for power operate without regard for age, context, or psychological readiness. The future does not wait for maturity. It arrives fully formed. Audiences struggled with the film's tone. It was neither purely adventurous nor comfortably light. Its implications were easy to overlook because they were embedded in a familiar structure. Hollywood moved on, uncertain how to frame a warning that did not rely on spectacle. Seen now, Cloak and Dagger feels precise. Technology increasingly enters lives before frameworks for understanding exist. The film was overlooked because it suggested that the most significant consequences of progress would be felt early, quietly, and without preparation. 8. Night of the Comet, 1984. Night of the Comet presents an end-of-the-world scenario defined by absence rather than destruction. Civilization does not collapse in fire or chaos. it simply stops. Streets empty, systems shut down, and familiar spaces remain intact without the people who gave them meaning. The future arrives quietly, without warning or explanation. The story follows a small group of survivors navigating a city where infrastructure outlives social purpose. Stores are stocked, electricity still runs, roads are clear. Yet the structures of community obligation and direction have disappeared. Survival becomes routine rather than resistance shaped by habit instead of urgency. The film's core idea is that collapse does not always announce itself. When systems are designed to function, without people their continued operation can mask the loss of collective life. Comfort remains, but context is gone. The world looks normal, but it no longer behaves normally. Audiences in the 1980s found this approach disorienting. Apocalyptic science fiction was expected to dramatize loss or rebuild meaning. Night of the Comet did neither. It treated emptiness as the defining condition of the future. Viewed today, the film feels unusually restrained. A society can persist materially while dissolving socially. The film was dismissed because it suggested that the future might not be violent or dramatic, but hollow, leaving people surrounded by functionality without purpose. 9 Firefox, 1982. Firefox situates its future within the logic of escalation. Technology advances not to improve life, but to gain advantage. The film introduces a weapon system controlled by thought-shifting conflict from physical capability to cognitive discipline. The narrative follows an effort to acquire this system before it alters the balance of power. Success depends less on engineering than on mental stability. Emotion, doubt, and hesitation become liabilities. Control moves inward where it cannot be observed or regulated. The film's warning is direct. When machines respond to intention rather than action, the human mind becomes the weakest component. Error is no longer mechanical. It is psychological. Responsibility becomes difficult to assign because failure originates internally. Audiences at the time viewed this premise as remote and overly abstract. The film emphasized tension over spectacle and restraint over action. It lacked the clear visual markers of threat common to Cold War narratives. Revisited today, Firefox feels grounded. Systems increasingly respond to behavioral and cognitive input. As technology absorbs decision-making, human limitation becomes a structural risk. The film was dismissed because it suggested that the future of control would be quiet, internal, and difficult to see. 10 Wolfen, 1981. Wolfen approaches the future through the lens of urban development rather than distant technology. Its setting is a modern city fractured by abandonment, expansion, and neglect. The threat it presents is not external invasion, but a response triggered by unchecked progress. The film centers on a series of events linked to redevelopment zones and decaying neighborhoods. Surveillance systems, forensic tools, and rational authority exist, but they fail to understand the forces they have displaced. Technology observes, but it does not comprehend. The core argument is that progress creates consequences that cannot always be managed through control or data. Expansion without accountability leaves gaps, physical, cultural, and ecological. These gaps become points of tension where modern systems lose authority. Audiences found the film difficult to classify. It offered no sleek futurism and no clear technological antagonist. Its future was implied rather than constructed, grounded in real-world patterns of displacement and neglect. Seen Now, Wolfen reads as a commentary on urban overreach. Development moves forward while understanding lags behind. The film was overlooked because it framed the future as something already forming within existing structures rather than a distant scenario waiting to arrive. 11. The Black Hole, 1979. The Black Hole stands apart from most studio science fiction of its era by treating technology as something that persists even after ethics have failed. Set aboard a drifting, self-contained system, the film depicts order without accountability and automation without conscience. Progress continues, but its purpose has narrowed to preservation rather than judgment. The story follows explorers who encounter a closed environment governed by strict routines and advanced machines. Human presence is minimal, and decision-making has been reduced to process. The system functions perfectly, yet the values that once guided it are absent. What remains is efficiency detached from responsibility. The film's central idea is that systems designed to endure will do so regardless of moral context. Technology does not correct error on its own. It preserves structure even when that structure no longer serves human needs. Stability becomes indistinguishable from stagnation. Audiences struggled with this approach. Marketed under a family-friendly banner, the film offered isolation, ambiguity, and unresolved consequences instead of optimism or discovery. It did not celebrate advancement or provide reassurance about humanity's role within its creations. Viewed today, the black hole feels less like an anomaly and more like a warning. Institutions and systems often continue operating long after their original purpose has eroded. The film was set aside because it suggested that technological order, when left unchecked, can outlast ethics without ever correcting itself. 12. Future World, 1976. Future World examines a future where artificial environments are designed to remove uncertainty from human experience. Technology exists to simulate danger, desire, and achievement without real consequence. What begins as controlled entertainment evolves into a system that reshapes behavior and identity. The film is set in a society where advanced replicas and automated systems replace direct experience. Choice appears unlimited, but agency is increasingly irrelevant. Individuals interact with simulations rather than reality, and responsibility fades as outcomes become reversible. The central idea is not that machines rebel, but that dependence becomes invisible. Control is not enforced through force, but through comfort. When systems function smoothly, scrutiny disappears. The future becomes stable, predictable, and quietly manipulative. Audiences initially viewed this premise as exaggerated. The film lacked dramatic confrontation and avoided overt catastrophe. Its warnings were embedded in structure rather than action. As a result, it was overshadowed by science fiction that framed technology as either threat or hero. Seen today, Future World reads as an early critique of mediated reality. Systems built for leisure gradually influence behavior, values, and perception. The film was dismissed because it suggested that the most effective forms of control do not feel oppressive. They feel convenient. 13. Damnation Alley, 1977. Damnation. Alley imagines the aftermath of global catastrophe without spectacle or resolution. The disaster has already occurred. What remains is a damaged landscape where survival is procedural and directionless. Civilization continues in fragments stripped of ideology or long-term vision. The film follows a small group navigating a post-nuclear environment defined by scarcity and constant threat. Technology still exists, but it no longer represents progress. It functions only as support for movement and defense. Hope is limited to reaching the next location, not rebuilding a future. What sets the film apart is its refusal to dramatize collapse. There is no rebirth, no clear lesson, no heroic turning point. Systems fail unevenly. People adapt without understanding what has been lost. The world does not end cleanly. It erodes. This approach confused audiences who expected science fiction to provide either warning through spectacle or optimism through renewal. Damnation Alley offered neither. It treated collapse as a condition rather than an event. The future it depicted was not dramatic enough to fear and not hopeful enough to embrace. Revisited now, the film's restraint feels intentional. Large-scale failure rarely arrives all at once. It unfolds slowly, leaving people to manage consequences rather than solutions. The film was overlooked because it presented survival as maintenance, not transformation. 14. Zardoz, 1974. Zardoz presents a future divided not by technology, but by outcome. One society survives through violence and scarcity. The other achieves immortality through advanced systems that remove risk, struggle, and urgency. Rather than celebrating this division, the film treats it as a dead end. Survival has been solved, but meaning has not. The story is set in a world where a small elite lives indefinitely inside a sealed, controlled environment. Their existence is orderly, painless, and stagnant. Outside this enclave, life is brutal and short. The contrast is deliberate. Immortality does not create wisdom or stability. It produces apathy. Without death, progress stops. Without consequence, creativity collapses. The film's core argument is simple and uncomfortable. A society that eliminates risk also eliminates purpose. Technology succeeds, but evolution fails. Systems remain functional long after the values that created them lose relevance. Control becomes maintenance rather than growth. Audiences in the 1970s rejected this vision because it contradicted the dominant idea that longer life and greater control would naturally improve civilization. Zardoz suggested the opposite. Comfort without limitation leads to decay, not advancement. The film was abandoned because it framed technological success as a form of failure rather than achievement. 15. Silent Running, 1972. Silent Running presents a future where environmental collapse is no longer debated. It has already happened, and society has adjusted accordingly. Earth's natural ecosystems are gone preserved only in space-borne domes that function less as sanctuaries and more as storage units. Nature survives, but only because it has been cataloged and removed from everyday life. The story follows a caretaker assigned to maintain these artificial forests. His role is practical, not ideological. Preservation is treated as a technical task rather than a moral commitment. When institutional priorities shift, the existence of these ecosystems is questioned not on ethical grounds, but on cost and efficiency. The conflict emerges quietly without spectacle or urgency. What makes the film distinct is its refusal to frame environmental loss as a sudden catastrophe. The damage is normalized. Systems continue operating. Decisions are made calmly. Responsibility is diluted across procedures and protocols. This approach felt restrained at the time, lacking the drama audiences expected from science fiction. The core idea remains consistent with the film's rejection. Progress does not guarantee stewardship. When preservation becomes inconvenient, it is reclassified as unnecessary. Silent Running does not argue that technology destroys nature, but that systems optimized for efficiency rarely protect what cannot justify itself economically. Revisited today, the film feels less speculative than observational. Environmental concern often survives as policy language, while practical decisions move in the opposite direction. Silent Running was set aside because it offered no reassurance, only a controlled procedural vision of loss that felt too close to reality. These films were not abandoned because they lacked vision. They were set aside because they presented futures that conflicted with prevailing expectations about progress. Each of them treated advancement as a process, with limits, trade-offs, and consequences, rather than a guaranteed improvement. At the time, that perspective was easy to dismiss. Revisiting these futures now reveals a pattern. None of these films relied on extreme speculation. They examined how systems behave when efficiency replaces responsibility, when control becomes more important than understanding, and when problems are managed rather than resolved. Those dynamics are no longer theoretical. The question then is not which of these futures came true. It is why so many of them felt uncomfortable enough to ignore when they were first released. Looking at the present, which assumptions about progress are we still protecting, and which futures are we quietly choosing not to see?